time for Cutting Edge Consciousness with Freeman Michaels and Barnet Bain. Thought-provoking discussions and bold ideas from the edge of possibility.
And welcome to Cutting Edge Consciousness. Freeman Michaels here.
With Barnet Bain. Good
we got
moment.
The long music underlay. I kind of like that. That's kind of sexy.
Do you like that? It
Spence.
does. We've got the whole musical bed thing going on here.
I like the long, low, slow fade.
That's because Spence is.
We're getting cooler
He's
every
come
year.
off of a long bout of FM radio coolness.
That's right. He's producing upstairs for other shows, and then all of a sudden we get the coolness that comes with.
Suddenly we're percolating down. This is the trickle-down coolness theory. If you get studioed far enough in the basement, the coolness does trickle down.
Oh my gosh, that's hysterical.
They're thinking of putting in windows here, I heard. Skylight.
No.
Yeah, skylights.
They have those tubes, those
Solo tubes.
Like you have to go find the sun somewhere.
Yeah.
They'd have to do that with that because we're really in a bunker.
Yeah, no, 4 stories of
tubing.
sub-basement. But we are getting FM coolness trickling down here.
Oh,
we have
goodness.
much to be grateful for. Plenty to be grateful for. I'm grateful for you, Spence, Mr. Music. So, good moment. How goes it?
It's a good moment. I mean, there's so many balls in the air. You were saying the other day, you have a lot on your plate. That's true. I've never really had as much on my plate.
My plate is so full. I'm used to, I grew up with those little TV dinner plates. Remember the little tin ones? The peas were in one corner.
Swanson.
Yeah, Swanson
TV dinner.
So those were orderly plates.
Yeah,
you knew where you were with a plate like that.
Peas were in one, which no one ever ate.
Nobody ate. I pushed them all into the mashed potatoes. But now my whole my plate is just piled high, and it's all mixed up. It's just craziness. And I don't know if this makes sense to anybody, but you ever find yourself you're doing something, and then all of a sudden you discover something else that you should be doing, and you set it down, and then you just stumble on it. There's this untied thread, and you realize, oh yeah, I have to get to that too. That's
kind of the miracle. Look, there is a way where everything does get done in some kind of timing. I most of my life, I've thought I needed to get organized.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And yet, if I can get above it and sort of view what I've been able to accomplish, in a given week, but in a lifetime. Mm-hmm. It's kind of remarkable how the method in the madness, I don't really know what it is, but it does work, right? So a lot of times we talk about context, like if we can really hold a context and then let whatever is inside of that context self-organize.
Yes.
Then it does take care of itself. And a lot of times, at least for me, there's been this real focus on the mechanics of things rather than on the context that then the mechanics organize around.
That's fantastic. All right, I'm going to very briefly share a story with you that I think illuminates your point.
I hope people understood that point. Hopefully your story helps.
Well, hopefully my story will pull into focus that. So I visit my in-laws over the weekend. They are snowbirds, and so they were down here.
That's right, Palm Springs.
Come down from Canada. And I have a brand new web home, a brand new.
I love your website.
Thank you.
I love it. It's fantastic. It's really beautiful.
Thank you so much.
It's got a great aesthetic.
Thank you.
It really represents you well.
Thanks so much. Anybody who wants to see it, go see it. www.barnetbain.com. How's that? That wasn't supposed to be a pitch, but, throw it out when you can do it. So my father-in-law looks at my website. And my father and I have only been married now for 34 years.
You said my father-in-law and I have only been married? You mean your wife and I?
My wife and I have been married for 34 years.
Well, I guess you're married. You buy the whole family.
You marry
it's a
the whole
package
father.
deal.
So my father-in-law for 34 years has not really understood that what my life was about. It all looks so haphazard.
It is haphazard.
And mostly it looks like the life of an amateur. Which is both beautiful because the amateur comes from the French aimer, to love. These are things that you love. But he looks at this site and he says, for the first time in 34 years, wow, I can see what your life is about. For the first time, he had a sense of what my life was about, that it added up to something. And I myself also took stock of that, and I realized, as you said with 20/20 hindsight, you suddenly get a sense of who you are and what you're about, and that there have been driving forces below the waterline of how you operate in the mayhem of the day-to-day mayhem that indicates a sense of not only mission, but a sense of purpose and a sense of vision, a dreaming, a quality of service, a commitment to life that emerges, and not everyone has a sense of that going in. It's wonderful if you do, but not everyone has a sense of that going in. So I think that speaks to the notion of what a personal culture is, and perhaps what a more systemic culture can be. We eventually, our culture will out. Eventually, what we value, what matters to us, where we put our attention, it will become obvious. But if it can become obvious beforehand, how much more powerful could that be?
Yeah.
You know, lot less confusion.
We should invite a guest in to clear this up for us.
Well, he doesn't know anything about that.
Come on, he knows a couple of
things.
things.
He does know a couple of things. We're so delighted to have you with us today. Robert Richman is a speaking and a culture consultant. For some of you, you'll be familiar with this name because he was the culture strategist and manager and the co-creator of Zappos Insights, and he's the author of the Culture Blueprint. And Robert, we are so glad to welcome you to Cutting Edge Consciousness.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's so great to be here with you guys.
Yeah, I'm personally in the middle of this conversation, doing some corporate training.
Some culture triage.
Culture triage with a company in Mexico, Banamex. It's the largest bank in Mexico.
Well, now we're going to have to speak really nicely about them.
It's yes, but this is a very, very pertinent conversation for me. Because we're doing a whole shift in how they operate. And we talk a lot in terms of context, right? We talk about what's the context for decision making. So let's start there. Culture and context. What is your link between these two?
I don't tend to use context a lot. I think that perhaps what's relevant in terms of what you're talking about context is using what I would call containers.
Great.
Of basically this idea that for self-organization to happen, there needs to be certain constraints. And you want constraints that have a good boundary to the game. Culture, in a lot of ways, I feel, is a game, and you need very clear boundaries to a game. What's in bounds, what's out of bounds, what are the rules, and ideally, they're very simple and few. One of the great lessons I learned, story from Tony Robbins, who said there was a father who had 15 kids, and they asked him what's the secret, and he said just have very few rules. If you have too many rules, it's pure chaos. Nobody is paying attention to them. Everybody's trying to get around them. Whereas if you have very few rules that are very stern, then there is self-organization. And I believe their two rules were be polite and be safe. And so what I find with culture is that if you take that concept of a container with these boundaries, and within that container for self-organization to happen, that's when the magic happens.
I love it. And this idea, too, of where there are sort of principles, right, as opposed to rules. So the creating a bunch of rules oftentimes feels very vertical, like it's a command and control type of operation, right?
Well, yes and no. I think that rules and principles are very important. They're both very important, and they're not at odds with each other. If you're trying to, when people confuse the two, because a principle is a recommendation, whereas a rule is actually a boundary that says if you do this, you're out. And I believe for strong organizations and teams to exist, there need to be rules that if you do something, you are kicked out.
Right. Except that, let me just use the example. So this bank that we're working with is mired in rules and bureaucracy. And it's like no one's taking a lot of steps without running into some kind of procedural dance they have to do. And so everyone's hogtied. And so this is really problematic. And it's so systemic within the culture that it's hard to move it, where people are sort of operating more from, not to diminish that there needs to be some rules, I get that, but more from a principle base, and there's more flexibility.
Sure, and unfortunately, in that type of situation, one of the principles, whether stated explicitly or implicitly, is you've got to go rogue. Because if there's too many rules and you can't follow them to get business done, then you literally have to violate the rules to get it done. So you're actually encouraging rogue behavior, which can lead to chaos, especially if you don't have the right people on board.
It's great. It's great insight. Thoughts on that, Barnett? Go rogue?
I'm always going rogue, so I am. What I love about what I'm hearing is that there is a sense of order. It's a paradox because we think by imposing regulations and imposing rules and imposing more and more structure that we can, by control, we can net out an outcome, and that the paradox is that the less that you do, the more that you are focused on values, the more self-organizing the organization can be. And one thing that people don't expect is that you net out more of those values, but how that shows up is often a surprise. So you have to be willing for it to really go wild and woolly. How many people do you find, Robert, who, when they sign up for Wild and Woolly, have the fortitude to buckle down and go along for the ride, because it can get very unpredictable and uncertain?
Sure. I mean, uncertainty happens regardless, I think. But I think that what can be really confusing to an environment is what are those rules that get you kicked out. Like, a good game, it's clear. You're playing soccer, and it's a good rule that you can't pick up the ball with your hands. It's constraining, but it allows for the game to be played, and everybody knows and everybody's playing with the same rules. The culture really gets uncertain when different rules apply to different people, and some people can violate them and some people can't, and that's when it gets really political.
Well, let's talk for a second about when we substitute. You're talking about substituting rules for a sense of ethics and a sense of values. And inside the container of values, people are largely self-correcting. If we go back to the Ten Commandments, for example, here's this playbook of rules to kind of to ensure that there is some sort of order in the land, and then along comes a superseding rule that says, if you can internalize the Ten Commandments enough, then at some point the only commandment that supersedes them all is just to be loving. It takes a kind of maturity and a sort of seasoning to be able to operate with the only rule being one of being in service to a higher set of ideals. You're more often we have a set of values, and those values are espoused, but they're not necessarily lived.
Right.
Do you find that to be the case in corporate life as well?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the only way that the rules can be self-correcting are if there are consequences. So it's a concept of high constraints or loose constraints with high integrity. That it's not very specifically defined, but if you violate it, there's a clear consequence to it. Without consequences, people can't self-organize because it's just, again, it becomes a recommendation as opposed to a real value in a rule, because the idea of core values is if you violate a core value, there's major costs. I mean, even in your own life, a lot of the times we've really gotten just down and upset, or is when we violated our own values. There's a cost to it. And so organizationally, if there's no cost, then there isn't the self-organization that everybody wants.
I guess my question is, or my concern is leading with the cost, right? So part of what the sense that there's a rigidity. I love this language you said, loose constraints with high integrity.
Yeah.
So the leading with the costs, from my perspective, doesn't feel like a good idea. Like, aren't the costs implied, or do we really need to sort of draw the hard lines of what gets you fired? I mean, I'm concerned about that. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah, I get it. I would say that you're right, that you don't lead from that perspective. the way you lead from it is, this is why we celebrate these values. This is how we live them. This is how it changed our lives. These are the stories. All the great things, absolutely, you lead with that. I just was focusing on the consequences, because the easier part is to focus on the good. But where I see organizations run into trouble is are they willing to make really tough decisions? You've got an amazing all-star salesperson, but they're violating the values. And guess what? Your revenue is about to go down if you hold to it. And that's where the rubber meets the road of, do you really live, and are you living by the values and run your organization by the values? So the only reason I really hamp on it, I don't think you lead with it, but this is where I see organizations and leaders getting hung up, because that's that crucial decision to make at that moment.
Big time. This is fantastic, because that actually becomes really important. We have to take a break. When we come back, here's what I want to talk about. So when someone gets fired because they really are in some way not playing as a team, or they're breaking some core value, how that then gets represented to the whole, so it bonds people versus scares them or fragments them. That's the topic I want to talk about, but we need to take a quick break and pay some bills. When we get back, we'll pick that up here on Cutting Edge Consciousness. Stay with us.
Welcome back to Cutting Edge Consciousness, thought-provoking discussions and bold ideas from the edge of possibility.
We're back on Cutting Edge Consciousness with Robert Richman. Freeman is in the house. Good to see you, Freeman, in the house.
So good to be seen.
It is good to be seen. It's good to be seeing. So before the break, you had something that you wanted to thread back to. I didn't make a note, so I don't remember what it was.
Well, I do. So, and it's even directly with a smaller company I've been working with, where there was clear that someone needed to be fired. But the challenge was how to pick up the pieces and be clear about why that person didn't work out. Because when you work to create community, and that's what we were doing, really working to create community, and then someone gets fired, it's a loss. It's dramatic. And then how that gets represented so that it
sometimes, but not all the time.
Well, this is ultimately, I think it was a relief. So don't get me wrong. I think in this situation, this person leaving was a relief. But it becomes a real challenge how that's represented to the community, so that there's a context for it. Does what I'm sort of wandering down make sense to you, Robert?
Yeah.
And how that gets handled. I mean, I loved your thoughts on how, when the line is crossed, how that's handled, so everyone's clear what happened, so that the grieving of the loss and the moving forward with what it means can be done in a constructive way.
Absolutely. I would preface this by saying, the same way if I were to make a nutritional recommendation, I'd say make sure to check with your doctor. I have a lot of great respect for the way HR professionals have respect for the law. And so I would definitely, there are certain laws, if you don't follow firing procedures in a certain way, you can end up in a lawsuit. So whatever you do, I would make sure, even if you don't have one on staff, check with somebody about any kind of firing procedure. That said, I would say that it's a great term that you bring up as loss, because what I've found, and the partners I work with, is that the transitions are always about grieving, because you're letting go of something. Even if it's a bad something, it's still a letting go. It's still a loss. And oftentimes we don't have that container for grieving. And mainly being that, can we just express how we feel? And can we say how we feel? And can we ask questions? And can we talk about it? And so one is having the space just to do that. And I think that's what's most important, because oftentimes it looks like, let's just get back to business. But having space for any kind of emotions to come up and process as a group is really important.
Yeah, this whole business and personal, right? It's business, it's not personal, feels like the big lie to me. Like, this is where I feel there's a disconnect in the way most of corporate America operates. This whole separation of, it's business. And then what does that do? It cuts off the humanity. And that's where I see a lot of this going wrong. And that's where actually the rules and the regulation, the procedures become dehumanizing, is because then the human being doesn't have their natural authenticity and self, right?
Yeah, I think the word I would use is, I would say business and personal are not at odds, because all business is run by people, so all business is personal. Where I'd say the disconnect is business and emotional, because most people feel like you can't, like, if you know, how many times have you seen it okay to cry in the workplace? Like, but that's a genuine emotion that somebody might feel in relation to passion or relation to another person, or just as much as we might get excited about a business idea, that's emotional. But there is this limited range of, these are the emotions that you're allowed in the business environment, but these ones, no, these ones are a problem. And I think that's where it gets into issues, is that if we feel like we have to block certain emotions and don't have a safe place to process them, that's when we become dehumanized.
Well, you said at the head that you weren't terribly in favor of the word context, but I want to reintroduce it here, because it seems to me that context is everything, whether it's in personal life, in family life, in any kind of social life or organizational life. It's context. And when the context of an organization is held as a celebration of values, then inside that there is or is not room for certain kinds of behaviors and emotional vulnerabilities and connections and intimacies. Now, when you were at Zappos, I've heard you speak about this, and so powerfully and so beautifully. Zappos was not, as you said, in the shoe business first. They were in the service business, and they weren't just in the service business. They were in the wow service business. They were the whole company was set up in order to create the most dramatic, the most fulfilling, intimate service experience, and to leverage it out into the world. That is a cultural context, it seems to me, that creates space for all sorts of vulnerability, all sorts of emotional connection. It creates a climate in which people go to work and celebrate.
Mm-hmm.
Your turn.
Your thoughts on that?
I agree with everything you say. I guess I just haven't found context to be a helpful word, just in the sense of it sounds like there are a lot of distinctions within context as to, because context is, I guess I would either need more definition or more distinction.
Well, let's broom the word context, because I'm not so interested in the word as I am interested in the notion that when individuals or organizations up-level how they show up in the world, from what can I get to what can I give, for how can I connect, and what is the biggest possibility for me to serve, to be of service, then our work life, our private life becomes a matter of celebration. And the need to impose rigor around rules is not the priority anymore. It becomes truly self-organizing around how can I perpetuate celebration and connection. And you certainly demonstrated that at Zappos.
Sure. Well, I think there's, the celebration is something that we developed as a habit. What I find is that organizations, even the best ones, forget to celebrate. And the way to do it is you build it in. Like you guys were talking about 10 Commandments, thou shalt observe the Sabbath, right?
Yeah.
You've got it built in as a habit. God invented the weekend.
Yeah.
We have it built in as a habit on Saturdays to relax and cut loose. If we didn't, we'd probably keep working and forget, and then get sick, and then every now and then be like, you know what, we need a vacation.
Yeah, so you baked that into the pie. You baked in and modeled top down a climate of engagement and celebration.
Yeah,
I like the word habit. I think that's fantastic. Let's make it a habit. Because look, we do talk in terms of positive habits and not so helpful habits.
Habits are practices.
Practices is even maybe a more helpful
is a
word.
conscious habit.
Yeah, let's make a practice of celebrating. I like it. And again, the practices all organize around something, right? They're organizing around, and we've broomed aside context, but they're organized around a shared sense of what we're up to. That, I don't know if it. Well, this is the question. Does it? the advantage of it being explicit versus it just being implicit, where people catch it. Because I think oftentimes it may not even be totally known to us why people like a certain thing, but obviously there's an underlying climate, there's an underlying values that they've been drawn to. Maybe there's a compelling leader who feels trustworthy and who feels like, they're someone we want to participate in building something with. So I don't know, is it helpful to have it really explicit? Because there's a lot right now in the business world around having your vision and your values posted and stated everywhere. And I wonder if that becomes a distraction, if it's just clearer to know internally.
Right. I mean, you're definitely onto it. That I believe all culture work, because culture exists whether you pay attention to it or not. It's not something that you have to build there. So all culture work, quote unquote, is about making the implicit explicit. That's all that we can really do, and have that explicit start to inform it. And I think, if it's just writing on the wall, then it's going to probably do harm, because the message of that is, do as we say, not as we do.
And it's brittle.
But it
becomes very, very brittle. And it doesn't change. Once you got it engraved in stone,
right,
or chiseled on the wall, it doesn't. It's not dynamic. It's not something that can morph Thursday. It's not something that can be reassessed in the next quarter or 5 years down the road.
And it may not even be felt. I mean, again, what I like about the habit language is that's something you're feeling. You're not just. I mean, yes, you're doing it as a practice or a habit, but it's also felt. It's embodied. It's something that isn't just a slogan.
It's not a head trip.
Yeah, it's not a head trip.
Totally.
Yeah.
So. We haven't talked a lot about your time at Zappos, which was so creative. You're definitely an outlier, and I'd love for you to share with our listeners just how it came to be that Zappos decided to create culture as the centerpiece of that business. How did that happen?
Tony, the CEO, really said it, because he had one of those fortunate experiences where he sold his first company, Microsoft, for $250 million. Then really didn't. Then one day when he found that he hit his alarm 9 times, he said, I'm going to leave some money on the table, because I just don't ever want to go to live a day where I'm not enjoying it. And so he left that and started his own ventures, and it was just that visceral an experience for him to say, you know what, doesn't matter revenue, doesn't matter profit. If we're not enjoying this every day, we're not doing it. And it was almost like a bet or a guess that would work well for business, because back in the day, this was the 90s, and getting people to buy shoes online and become the biggest shoe store on the web, those are no easy tasks, but it was by developing this culture of people who really love to work together that it happened.
One of the distinctions you make, which I really am enamored with, is, and maybe I'm getting the language wrong, but intrapreneur, and the idea that you were able to create almost an entrepreneurial enterprise, but within Zappos. That's very interesting for me, both in what you did, but also in the implications that you are now part of what you're offering in the world is you suggest other people do this in whatever way works for them. Can you explain that piece of the puzzle?
Sure. So like any business innovation, it starts with a market need. So what Zappos had done was to just open its doors and say anybody can come in to tour, anybody can come meet with anybody that you want at the company, and that got really overloaded. So by sharing the culture, one of the principles I talk about is what you share, you get to keep. And so the company kept sharing its culture and sharing it until Tony, the CEO, realized, wait a minute, there's a business here. We need to make this a business in order to keep it going. And he and I both were really engaged around this concept of cost centers becoming profit centers. If you're really doing it best of class. So with best of class culture and best of class service, it internally it looks like a cost, all the money you're spending on employees and returns, customer service. But if it's world class, then it can actually become a profit center. So we created a company within and developed, through literally its own company, its own entity, an entrepreneurial venture. And I think that this kind of entrepreneurial thinking is really what's cutting edge, that there's so much writing on being a startup and an entrepreneur, and a lot of people don't realize you can do that in a company that's already existing.
So just to clarify for our listeners, these nested businesses within the business that you're referring to, that includes the tours, that includes the culture curriculum. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly. Tours, boot camps, conversations, culture books that get sent out, a lot of experiences around culture.
Mm-hmm. And even a training. The part of what you were, the company within the company became a training ground. So basically, this is what I understood that you founded, was sort of this training center. So people were coming in and you were actually providing training for them.
Exactly. What I was so proud of what we did there, and actually the company continues to do as I've moved on, is culture is an experience, and it's about people shifting their beliefs about what's possible for culture. And I believe the only way you can really do that is through experiences. And so most training, you're going to a corporate hotel room and you're in some fluorescent lights sitting down hearing somebody talk. Whereas what we did is we actually opened up the doors to people to become a part of the culture. You interact with people there. You're actually on the phones with customer service agents. You become a part of the culture. And because we found it's experience more than any type of best practice or information we shared that really shifted beliefs of what's possible.
This is the experiential learning piece, which is...
And you had better lighting.
Better lighting. Lighting is actually environment. I mean, this sure. Conversation about environment, that culture is an environment, an energetic quality that people experience. You know, again, the backdrop is based on values and so forth, but even the physical plant, I don't know what Zappos looks like, but I know this conversation in hospitals has been a theme, that there's some really extraordinary facilities that have said, wait a minute, healing can happen best in a different kind of environment than the sterile environment of the traditional hospital. Maybe you can speak to that, just creating an entire environment as part of a culture. Is that part of what you would prescribe?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it was so strong that I remember a New Yorker coming through saying, he said, I'm being really nice here. He said, I'm never nice, but everybody's so nice here. I find myself smiling, being nice to everyone. Context makes a huge difference. Talk about the medical environment. I think what people don't especially realize whenever anybody talks about the placebo effect is, in a lot of ways, it's the context effect, because they're not being given pills and sent home and then being asked how did the journey go when they're testing out pills and have placebos with it. They're actually in a healing environment. They're paying attention to it. They have a lot of supportive people around them. And that attention and that context and that focus have a lot to do with making the placebo work as opposed to just mental trickery.
See, now we've done this. We created an environment. You came in here and now you're using the word context. And you like it, don't you? No.
Come on, admit it. Admit it. By a show of hands now. Who likes the word context?
Oh, that's fantastic.
We're gonna loop this for you,
right.
Robbie, and put it on your website.
Hey, listen, I want to thank you for coming and hanging with us. Before we let you go, we've got to give folks your info, your book, your website, what you're up to.
And folks, Robbie's an amazing speaker. So if you have an opportunity to hear him speak, let us know when and where you are speaking, what you're up to, and where our listeners can learn more about your work.
Thank you. My blog and website are at robertrichman.com, and like Brian said, I speak. I lead even improv for teams and all kinds of different experiences around culture. And then my book is called The Culture Blueprint, and that's at cultureblueprint.com.
Awesome. Thanks for playing with us.
Thanks so much.
My pleasure.
See you
Thanks
soon.
for having me, guys.
And for those of you listening, we invite you to stay tuned, because Barnett and I will be back after these messages to wrap things up here on
Put things into context.
Cutting Edge Consciousness. Stay with us.
We'll be right back.
Welcome back to Cutting Edge Consciousness, thought-provoking discussions and bold ideas from the edge of possibility.
For context, this is Cutting Edge Consciousness.
It is Cutting Edge Consciousness,
and
isn't it? Yeah.
That's the environment we want to invite you into.
That's the state, that's the mood. So the interesting thing about about context. It seems to me.
We should count how many times we say it. Between now and the end of the show.
Let's get a counter. Boom. So it seems to me that context is another way to speak of mood.
Sure.
Of climate, of environment. I think it was Goethe that said famously, that wrote famously, that he understood that everything was a result of his own climate, of his own personal climate. Everything that happened in the world was an extension of his personal mood and climate. And so, to the degree that we can self-forge a personal climate, be the authors of our own mood, and expand that to being supportive of authoring a group mood, a culture mood, an organizational mood, then culture and mood become one thing. So just as mood is causal, if I have a perpetual mood of pessimism, then I self-organize around that. I will look for ways and reasons to affirm my pessimism.
Totally. So this context issue
is everything.
It is. It's a deeper look at what's the driving, or what's the operating system, maybe is the language to use.
In which we respond.
Totally. So becoming, because everything is organizing around beliefs, agreements, expectations, these backdrop of us, and if we can shift the backdrop a little,
it's an attitude.
What you brought up about the love commandment, right? Love your neighbor as yourself. The trick, of course, is to love yourself, which is always where we stumble a little bit.
Your neighbor is yourself.
Right. Well, that's
another show. That'll be back next week.
You can keep that here. The next piece is that there's a unity principle, that we really aren't that separate. That's also a tripping place. But that love becomes the context. How do I be more loving? Like, how do I apply love to this? Especially the things that are hard to love, right? How do I get underneath it and really, and expressions of love, acceptance, understanding, forgiveness, even choices like boundaries.
Reducing the fear of humiliation. Creating safety for yourself and others. Creating pleasure, emotionally, mentally, physically, in ways that are appropriate for yourself, for others. There are, we will explore the dimensions of love for the rest of our lives, and who knows what goes on after that, but certainly for the rest of our days, we'll explore the dimensions of love. And then to embody what we learn, what real estate we gain around love.
A culture that does that.
To culture it. You culture it the way you culture bacteria. You culture love bacteria.
That's a more profound reason to go to work in the morning than because I have to make a living, because if I don't, I'm going to get kicked out of my apartment and I'm going to end up under a freeway overpass.
I'm trying to culture an environment of respect, an environment of connection, an environment of imagination and of aliveness and vitality and volition. I am trying to culture that in the way that I would grow a flower or a field.
It's beautiful. And then people who come into that, immediately feel it, like the New Yorker who got there and said, well, I'm smiling all the time. Yeah, because there's a held space. Yeah? Space.
I was at a company in Montreal about a year ago called Sid Lee, and it's marketing and advertising. They're geniuses. They're just amazing company. It's owned by Cirque du Soleil. So you can imagine. That's
such a great example of kind of what we were talking about. I'll let you finish.
Yeah.
But the whole Zappos says, wait a minute, we're really in the culture game, or at least that's a business nestled inside of business. But go on.
Well, you're exactly on my point. So you come into this this brilliant. They're such brilliant people. They're brilliant as designers and creators and messengers. They're brilliant because they're having fun.
Yeah.
So no, it's not that they're brilliant as eggheads.
Right.
They're brilliant because they are fully alive, because they are having fun, and they create community. And so they foster an environment, they culture an environment, they're growing an environment of intimacy and connection and respect of themselves and others, and they're having fun. Now, when you walk into the building, there is this little room. You come into this little room from the outside, and in the room, It's very dramatically lit in these incredibly vibrant colors, and it has like these incredible furniture, and there's a big box. They sit you down in this room, and they close you off in there, and there's this big box. And there's nothing to do in there. Eventually, you explore. So I open the box, and in the box is a big book. And in the book, you pull open this giant book, and it says, it has writings in there of what we love about working in this place.
Oh, wow.
And it's people who work there write about what matters to them, about their families and their work families and their colleagues and their mission and their vision, and they write about this. And so 5 minutes, 10 minutes in this anteroom reading this, and you are steeped. You are steeped in the values, in the juiciness, in the aliveness, in the vitality of what it is to be in this organization. And then they open the next door, and it goes from this tiny little room bathed in this weird light to this gigantic playroom. It's gigantic. There's probably 30, 40 desks in there. They're not desks so much as these incredible play spaces, and all of this fantastic work goes on in there.
So I just thought of a couple of things. Two thoughts came to mind. One is the StoryCorps. You know about StoryCorps.
Yes,
it's a booth. They had it at like Grand Central Station at one point. I don't know if it's still there. And people went in and told their story. And I love the idea of kind of StoryCorping in a company, like to put a booth where people go in and tell their story, and then people within the company can hear the story. So they learn more about each other.
It's beautiful.
It's so beautiful. And then the other one is that game that I was telling you about. We'll see if I'm getting a copy of it, and if I like it, I'll put it on the show.
You told me about it, but you didn't tell our listeners.
Well, it's called Tell Me, and it was developed by a psychologist up in San Francisco who developed this game as a sort of an icebreaker, but really you could play with anyone. And it was there were profound questions. I only saw a handful of them, and I want to see the full deck. There are 50 of them. And the idea is you're sharing yourself in a more profound way. So this isn't what you might ask of someone. We tend to meet people in sort of safe areas, right? And you and I know from our work that when we get into environments where we kind of break through that and we have a deeper experience, we call it the more real. Sometimes we've said, yeah, that's a reality and you can operate in that. It's a sort of politeness and it functions. But then when you dive a little deeper and you actually get to know someone, you feel like you can, that's the more real, right? And you and I have wanted more and more to splash around in that more real.
In my experience of the more real, I have yet to experience an example of that when I have not felt my heart open to the other person. I have no experience of that where I haven't felt more love.
It's interesting because when I'm in a certain state, energetic state, people feel very comfortable telling me things that they normally wouldn't tell other people. And they almost always at some point say, I can't believe I'm telling you this. And I recognize that I'm a space, if you will, going back to that.
You're a context.
I'm a context where they can feel seen and heard, and I'm showing up that way. And I wonder
You're a Petri dish.
Because I think this leadership quality, what are the qualities of a leader, right? What are the qualities that make someone a leader? And I think that is a quality that I would put as a leader, that where people feel safe to tell you things. That's beautiful. And I don't think in most corporate trainings, culture building exercises, that's really emphasized. That people feel beautiful. Safe with that.
That is really beautiful. What I admire, one of the things I admire in leaders is their ability, their talent for fostering the more in others.
Yes.
For fostering an environment that allows other people to become more who they can be.
I feel supported and seen and encouraged. It's interesting. I have several mentors. You're one of them, frankly, because I feel like I've grown so much in relationship with you, where I really feel like they want for me what I want for me. That's a quality where someone shows up really wanting to see how much greatness they can experience of me, and I feel permission, I feel supported, and I feel loved. And then all of a sudden what comes out of me is a kind of latent potential that because, my primary operating system, as is yours, as is most people, what we've called the sort of adaptive personality, is self-protection, right? So I run around with the self I'm comfortable with you seeing, but the greater sense of who I am is sort of latent in lots of ways. And then someone comes along and they hold the context or the space for me to come out, and all of a sudden I am. And it's such a brilliant quality of a leader.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. They embody, they are able to contain a larger sense of who they think they are. And who they think they are is, in a leader, is rarely egoic.
Yeah, I love it.
Who they think they are is not me, it is almost always we.
That's
In
fantastic.
an effective leader.
Yeah.
I'm making a distinction now between managers. There's nothing wrong with managers. I'm not making a hierarchy here. I'm just making a distinction between a manager and a leader. A leader creates a community, even if it's a community of one. And a manager is more attuned to organizing parameters.
Right. And then you have the manager who is primarily a leader, and they're managing in a very different way. It kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier, or maybe you were talking about it, where they're less needing to hold rules. They are a context within which people kind of get the rules, right?
Yeah.
Within the context of their leadership, you don't gossip. You don't throw people under the bus. You don't grandstand, because it doesn't make sense, right? That's not and there isn't a lot of necessity for finger wagging and for rules, because that's not the context. Like, you don't do that here. It's like you go into a church and you don't juggle and throw a parade. It's just not the right context, And there are those odd people that don't get it, right? And of course, they're going to have to organize out one way or another, and call your HR or your attorney, as Robert was saying, and make sure you do that correctly. But that said, they can't stay there because it doesn't fit in the context. I do think it's a context game. There may be other words and language for that, but for me, that's the right language.
I don't know how we're doing for time here, guys.
We're near the end.
We have 1 minute, so we could go into a whole nother area. It is.
But it lost into it. We got 30 seconds. Let's launch a conversation that's going to take at least an hour.
Let's back in at 18-wheeler here.
Right.
So the more we sort of ruminate around the context buzzword, the more it seems to me that from the inside out, to the degree that I can recognize myself as larger and larger relationships with my own context and the context that I'm operating in, is the degree to which I become more and more empowered and can empower others.
It's beautiful. And other people feel more seen and more whatever.
Yeah.
It's, I'll say something. Over the 5 years we've been in the show and that we've been friends, I've seen your context grow. I've seen more space for people to be exactly who they are and you to be more loving. I know that's true for me, sitting in this seat, but I think it's true in a larger sense as well, because I see you obviously in our community around other friends, and just how more and more you become a safe place for them to go hang out. You're sitting on the couch, someone comes and sits next to you. Well, that's an indication of their context, that's something that people would want to do. And that's really worth noting. If I sit at the couch, will people come sit next to me? Am I showing up as a generous offer in the world? Or am I showing up as someone that, isn't? And that's okay when we aren't. We can hold that. The loving context is big enough to even hold that part of the puzzle.
It's interesting you say that. As a young man, I felt that I felt more powerful by having walls.
Yes.
I felt more powerful by having a persona that felt unapproachable. I felt more powerful about that, and as I got older, that fell away.
And that's the good news.
That is the good news.
All right, and with that, we have to fall away. We hope that you will tune in next week and join us again.
See you then.